I've been puzzling about this question for a long time. How is it that a guy like Fred Ross, who has been financing and encouraging with his Art Renewal Center classical realist movement, which started in the 90s without him? I mean, he came along 20 years after the thing started to encourage it. So it got started without him, and I suppose he's helping it along. But it came out of nothing except the desire of certain painters who worked without any help or opposition from any government or any galleries or anything, and have created this art movement, which has now become a contender. It's a serious thing. Or you look at a guy like Damien Chavez,
Explicitly sexual themes depict genitalia.
who also, all on his own, with influence from his parents and whatever else, has developed as an artist and does the artwork that he wants to do without any opposition or particular support, as far as I know. Or again, a guy like Gio, who is so convinced of this whole Zeitgeist thing. I mean, you can throw in Fenn and that whole group. They're so convinced of the Zeitgeist deal, and they're all stuck on this idea that government policy is responsible for what I call the collapse of art, and what they complain is, or Damien certainly complained, Damien and Fred Ross complain, is the deliberate corruption of art in the interest of this and that. I mean, we've heard their discourse. Or, from a somewhat different point of view, Geo and those people accept that the evolution that's led to contemporary art is legitimate, except that they think that now it's been captured politically and they want to steer it politically in a different direction. So all of that to me is a brew that comes out of the same pot. And of course it's contradictory because all of these guys, whether it's Fenn, Gio, or Chavez, they have their own ideas, artistically I mean. As artists, they have been completely free and they followed their own inspiration and tried to realize their ideas without any interference or any help. And when you study in the proper way the development of what's called modernism, that's what you see. You see, the Impressionists. Impressionism became so terrifically influential, and it was started out by a bunch of guys who were poor, and eventually they became very successful, but it took years. They struggled along without any help and without any interference for years. Renoir had a famous run-in with Bouguereau. Bouguereau was the head of the Academy, and I don't know, I can't remember what that was about, but anyway, maybe Renoir was trying to study at the Academy or something. Anyway, Bouguereau treated Renoir very badly. He treated him with arrogance, but that didn't stop Renoir. And Renoir became as successful as Bouguereau was. Renoir is 10 times, 100 times more successful, both as an artist and in terms of money. The price of a Renoir is way beyond the price of a Bouguereau. Rightly or wrongly, the point is, I'm not trying to make an artistic point. I'm simply trying to say that Bouguereau, as head of the Academy, and the Academy in France is tied up with the government. I mean, if anybody had influence and power at that time, it was Bouguereau. But look who won out. And then if you look at Picasso, the same thing. Picasso and his pals at the Bateau Lavoir and everything, they were completely broke, and they were doing this stuff. And eventually, certain people were interested, and they started having a dealer, people, Kantweiler and so on, who believed in what they were doing, and who marketed it, and eventually helped make artists like Picasso very successful. But meanwhile, lots of other things were going on. It's not like the government came in and said, okay, nobody gets to paint except Picasso and people who imitate Picasso. Such a thing never happened. It is true that in the 30s, governments all over the world put a lot of money into art because they wanted propaganda, and artists gave them what they want. But that didn't change anybody's artistic, personal artistic directions. They did what the state wanted. The state wanted illustrations of this or that, whether it was masculinity or the proletarians or anti-capitalism, whatever it was, heroic, whatever. They did their best to satisfy that. But after the war, all that dried up. And artists who had done work like that went back to doing what they wanted to do. Most of the abstract expressionists had worked as social realists in the 30s. They'd all learned to draw. They could do that, but what they wanted to get into this abstract thing, it was you can study it. I wrote a whole book about it. They were interested in abstraction for these very specific reasons. I think they were misguided, even though those ideas were important from the point of view of painting and art. What happened was wrong. It was driven by non-artistic ideas, but it was the artists who were doing it. And then this very odd thing happened in the 60s in New York, where abstract expressionism, for a time, became the only thing that was legitimate. The government had nothing to do with that. The galleries and the intellectuals, the critics, and a lot of artists simply abandoned anything else but that. And it didn't last very long. That had a long influence, that event. But it didn't stop artists. So right away you had all kinds of figurative painting. You had Janet Fish and optical realism. You had photorealism, Chuck Close, and so on. All things got going, and Warhol became famous. And stuff like that was going on. Warhol wasn't sponsored by the government, and art, Manzoni and all kinds of artists who were in New York at the time doing things like that. People got interested in Warhol, and he was promoted, and he became a big deal. But that didn't stop other things from going on. What happened in the 60s became completely ideological. It took over the schools. I saw this, but the government wasn't telling anybody what to do. It was the people involved, the teachers, the students. Take abstraction. Nobody was spoon feeding the students. The students were going for the teachers. Aaron's two main teachers, Cameron Booth and Václav Vitlichel, they were going to Munich to study with Hoffman. They were going to Capri in the summer to study with Hoffman. And they convinced Hoffman to come to the States. These were just people who were into that. Meanwhile, other people were interested in other things and doing other things. The academic painting world kept going on. Okay, so the question is, why are people like Ross and Chavez and also these right-wing types like Geo and Fenn, Farrow and all those guys, why are they so hepped on this idea that the CIA and the government, Alexander Adams is always convinced he's got to change government policy so that he can get ahead? Why do they think that? It's this vulgar Hegelian thing of believing that somehow individuality doesn't count. But it's just an intellectual thing. They don't live like that. They live individually like they have complete freedom, but it's everybody else who's being manipulated. There was a comment on my attack on the Art Renewal Center in Fred Ross, the last video I did. This long comment, this person berating me for not understanding anything and defending the Art Renewal Center's position. And I asked him, are you a painter? And if you're a painter, why don't you say, who's manipulating you? What is it you're doing? How are you being manipulated? What is called now cognitive dissonance. These people, on the one hand, they're convinced that art is all about the zeitgeist, that people are motes in the flow of history. They're toys in the hands of history and the zeitgeist. And then some of them, like that silly girl, what's her name? They come right out and say they want to grab a hold of the zeitgeist and manipulate it and steer it. And what's that about? So on the one hand, we're victims of the zeitgeist. On the other hand, we want to be masters of the zeitgeist. On the third hand, everybody lives as if they're completely free. Of course, to the extent that people have been bamboozled into thinking that art is one thing or another, or have tangled themselves up like that. For instance, Chavez, he's utterly convinced of this classical thing he's got with design. He's got this whole theory. Well, he's backed himself into a corner. So in a way, he's manipulating himself. So to that extent, people are manipulated, but they're responsible for their own manipulation. They're letting themselves be corralled into something. But if you look at what has happened, particularly in what used to be called modern painting, in other words, starting with Giotto and Cimabue and what was going on in the 14th century, and then what came out of it, and how those things came out, it's pretty obvious that individual freedom has an awful lot to do with it. Of course, the opportunities that people have are important too, and that depends on how society is configured and what's going on. But what has happened in Western art, which is so remarkable and so different than what we see in the art of other cultures. Japan is a little bit different because Japan allowed itself to be influenced by China and then be influenced by the West. So it took those things in, and then individuals did what they did with that. But the art in China has remained very, very stable, or art in India, very stable for centuries and centuries. So the obvious difference with the West is that in the West, things can happen, which also means that things can go badly. Well, freedom is not simply a positive value, but without it,